My fingers wouldn't stop shaking. Not from cold, it was the middle of July, and the air conditioner in my apartment had been broken for 2 weeks. They were shaking because I had just stared at my phone screen for 4 full minutes, rereading the same number, hoping it would change. It didn't. The balance on my savings account read $214.37. 3 days ago, it had been $91,000. Before I get into what happened, can you do me a favor? Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I always love knowing who's out there. It means more than you think. My name is Daniel. I'm 31 years old. I'm a licensed electrician. And for the past 6 years, I've worked harder than almost anyone I know. Overtime on weekends, double shifts in the winter. I skipped vacations, drove a truck with a cracked windshield for 2 years, and ate lunch out of a cooler every single day because I refused to spend money I hadn't earned the right to spend yet. I had a plan: pay off my truck, build savings, put a down payment on a small house, nothing fancy, just something mine, something no one could take away. I was 8 months from that house. My brother's name is Reed. He is 4 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, he has had a way of making other people feel small so that he could feel large. Growing up, I told myself that was just how brothers were, that every family had a Reed, that when we got older, it would smooth out. The way rough wood eventually becomes something you can run your hand across without bleeding. It didn't smooth out. Reed had worked a string of jobs over the years: logistics coordinator, sales rep, some kind of franchise opportunity he never explained in full detail. Each one lasted about 2 years before something happened that was, according to him, never his fault. His wife, Carla, was patient with him, in the way that certain people are patient with things they've already quietly given up on. They had a daughter, my niece Piper, who was 7, and who I genuinely adored. Piper was the reason I kept showing up to family events I would otherwise have found reasons to miss. The wedding was my cousin Marcus's idea. He and his fiancée had rented a lake house in northern Wisconsin for a long weekend, Thursday through Sunday, and the whole extended family was invited. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, their kids. It was the kind of thing that sounds beautiful in the planning and complicated in the execution. 43 people sharing a property for 4 days. I almost didn't go. I had a job that weekend, a rewiring project for a commercial building that would have paid well. But my mother called and said that Grandpa's health had been declining, and that this might be the last reunion he'd be strong enough to attend. I rearranged my schedule. I drove 6 hours north. The property was genuinely stunning. A main lodge with a wraparound porch, a dock that stretched out over still water, a fire pit ringed with Adirondack chairs. My cousin Marcus had done well for himself, and he was generous with it, the kind of generous that doesn't need to announce itself. The food was good. The weather held. Piper ran around with 3 other children her age, and came back to the adults every few hours, with grass stains and an enormous grin. On the second night, Friday, most of the family gathered around the fire after dinner. Someone brought out a case of beer. Someone else started a playlist. My uncle told a story about the time he and my grandfather got their truck stuck in a ditch during a hunting trip in 1987, and my grandfather laughed at the parts he remembered and looked peaceful at the parts he'd forgotten. I sat with a beer going warm in my hand and thought that this was exactly why I had come. Reed came and sat beside me around 10 o'clock. He'd had more than a few drinks. I could tell by the way he settled into his chair, too careful, too deliberate, the way people sit when they're concentrating on appearing steady. "You know what your problem is?" he said. Without introduction. "I'm sure you'll tell me," I said. "You think saving money is a personality." He said it like it was something he'd been holding for a while. "You walk around here like you've got everything figured out. 90 grand in the bank. Good for you, Daniel. You want a trophy?" I looked at him. "How do you know what I have in the bank?" He shrugged in a way that didn't actually answer the question. "Mom mentioned it." I made a note of that and let it go. Or I tried to. "I'm not trying to fight with you," I said. "I'm not fighting. I'm being honest." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "The family needs help, Daniel. You know that. Dad's knee surgery isn't covered fully. Mom's car is 1 bad month away from the shop. And you're sitting on a pile of money doing nothing. It's not doing nothing. It's a down payment on a house you don't need yet. I'm 31, Reed." He stood up, and I thought the conversation was over. Instead, he looked down at me and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "Just think about it. That's all I'm saying." I didn't think about it, or rather, I thought about it in the way you think about something you've already decided isn't happening. Saturday was easier. Reed avoided me, and I avoided him. I spent most of the day on the water with Marcus and our uncle, fishing badly and talking about nothing important. By evening, I felt reset, the way a long day outside can sometimes do. There was a big dinner, a rehearsal of sorts for the wedding ceremony that would happen the following afternoon. Speeches, toasts, laughter. Someone made cocktails, strong ones. I had 2 over the course of 3 hours, which was less than most people around me, and thought nothing of it. Around midnight, I walked back to the small cabin I was sharing with 2 cousins who had already turned in. I remember setting my phone on the nightstand. I remember lying down on top of the covers because it was still warm. I remember the ceiling. Then I remember nothing until morning. I don't mean I fell asleep normally. I mean there is a clean, hard edge where my memory ends. The way a film reel just stops. I've had maybe 6 drinks in a night before, and never once experienced that. I'm not a heavy sleeper. I wick it sounds. That night I was simply gone, and then it was 7:42 inches the morning, and my mouth tasted like something chemical, and my head felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with a headache. I picked up my phone. I read the number. I read it again. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. My 2 cousins were still asleep. Through the window I could see the dock, the water, a heron standing at the edge like it was considering something. Everything looked exactly the same as it had the day before, and I was sitting there holding a phone that said my life savings were almost entirely gone. I opened the transaction history. 3 transfers, all executed between 1:14 and 1:52 inches the morning. Sent to an external account I did not recognize. The bank's app showed that the authorization had been completed using my fingerprint. My fingerprint. While I was unconscious, I want to be honest about what the next hour felt like. It wasn't panic exactly. It was something quieter and colder than panic, a kind of clarity that comes when something is so wrong that your body stops wasting energy on noise and just goes very, very still. I got dressed. I walked to the main lodge. I poured a cup of coffee, and I sat down at the kitchen table, and I pulled up my bank's fraud line. I reported the transactions as unauthorized. The representative was kind and thorough. She flagged the account, initiated a dispute, and told me that because of the unusual pattern and the timing, an investigation would be opened within 48 hours. She also told me, gently, that cases involving biometric authorization were more complex, and that I should document everything I could. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat there and thought about who had been near me the night before, who knew what I had saved, who had asked me, less than 24 hours ago, to think about it. I found Reed at the dock, alone, drinking coffee and watching the water. Carla and Piper were back at their cabin. The wedding wasn't until 2. We had time. I walked out to the end of the dock and stood beside him and said, without raising my voice, "Tell me about the account." He didn't look at me. "What account?" "The one you sent my money to last night." A pause. He took a sip of his coffee. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Reed." I kept my voice level. I had decided, before I walked out there, that I was not going to give him the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. I was unconscious. My phone was used. My fingerprint. $90,000 is gone. And you told me last night that you knew exactly what I had saved. He turned then, and what I saw on his face was not guilt exactly. It was something more calculated than guilt. An assessment. He was deciding how much I knew and how much he could still get away with. "You gave it to me?" he said. I stared at him. "You were awake. You unlocked your phone. You agreed." He said it flatly, like a man reciting a thing he had rehearsed. "I've got witnesses." "You drugged me." "That's a serious accusation." "Yes," I said. "It is." I walked back to the cabin. I packed my bag. Before I left the property, I did 3 things. I went to the lodge kitchen and found the cocktail glasses from the night before, still sitting in the drying rack. Someone had washed them, but I took mine anyway and sealed it in a Ziploc bag I found in a drawer. I took photographs of the dock, of the fire pit area, of the layout of the property, and I stopped at my grandparents' cabin and told my grandfather that I loved him and that I was sorry I had to leave early, and he held my hand and said that was all right, and I stood there for a moment, longer than I needed to, because I didn't want to let go. Then I drove south. I want to be precise about what happened in the next 2 weeks, because the details matter. On Monday morning, I went to an urgent care clinic and told them I believed I had been drugged. They drew blood and sent a toxicology panel. The results came back 72 hours later. Traces of a sedative, the kind that leaves the system quickly and is difficult to detect after 48 hours. The doctor who reviewed the results said the window for detection had been narrow and that I had been lucky to come in when I did. I brought that report to a lawyer named Patricia, who a coworker had used the year before, and who came recommended with specific and credible praise. Patricia reviewed the bank records, the toxicology report, and the transaction logs. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Do you want to pursue this criminally, civilly, or both? Both, I said. She nodded once, like she had expected that answer. The civil case moved first. Patricia filed for an emergency freeze on the external account Reed had transferred to. The bank's fraud investigation, combined with the toxicology evidence and the transaction timing, was enough for a judge to grant the freeze within the week. Most of the money was still there. Reed had withdrawn about $12,000 in cash, but the remaining $78,000 was frozen. The criminal complaint moved more slowly, which Patricia had warned me about. In the meantime, my family fell apart. My mother called me 4 days after the reunion. She had heard from Reed, and Reed's version of events was, apparently, that I had been drunk and reckless and had willingly transferred money to help the family and was now having regret and trying to take it back. She didn't say she believed him outright. What she said was, "Daniel, this is going to destroy the family. Can't you find another way?" I said, "Another way to recover money that was stolen from me while I was sedated?" She went quiet. "Mom," I said, "do you know that he knew my exact balance?" Someone told him. Before I ever arrived at that reunion, someone had told him what I had saved. Another silence. Then, he asked me. He said he wanted to know if you were doing all right. I closed my eyes. I didn't know he was going to, she started. "I know," I said. "I know you didn't." My father called the next day. His approach was different, less emotional, more transactional. He said that Reed had a daughter, that a criminal case would affect Piper, that there had to be a way to handle this within the family. He said the word family the way some people say it, as though it were a closed system with its own rules that superseded the rules of everywhere else. I said, "If a stranger had sedated me and stolen $90,000, you would tell me to call the police." He didn't answer that. "He's not a stranger," he said finally. "No," I said. "He's worse. I want to tell you about Reed's wife, Carla, because she is the part of this story that surprised me most." Carla called me on a Wednesday evening, about 10 days after the reunion. I almost didn't answer. When I did, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I didn't know he was going to do it. I want you to know that." I said I was listening. She said that Reed had told her before the trip that he was going to talk to Daniel about a loan, that she had assumed that meant exactly what it sounded like, a conversation, a request. She said she had no idea about the sedative, about the phone, about the transfers. She said she had found out the same way I had, in pieces, as the story stopped making sense. "I've already talked to a family law attorney," she said, "for myself, for Piper." I told her I was glad she had. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said. "I know that doesn't fix anything." "It doesn't," I said, "but thank you for saying it." After I hung up, I sat in my apartment for a long time. It was late. The city outside was doing what cities do, never entirely quiet, never entirely still. I thought about Piper. I thought about what it means to be a child in a family where the adults have decided that the rules don't apply to them. I thought about all the versions of myself that had given Reed the benefit of the doubt over the years, and I tried not to be angry at those versions, because they had been trying to hold something together. The civil hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning 6 weeks after the reunion. Reed showed up with a lawyer whose strategy, as far as I could tell, was to introduce as much confusion as possible. He argued that the transfer had been consensual, that I had been drinking heavily and making impulsive decisions, that the toxicology report was inconclusive. The sedative found could theoretically have been from over-the-counter medication. Patricia had anticipated all of this. She presented the transaction logs, showing that 3 separate transfers had been executed in a 3-8-minute window in the middle of the night. She presented phone records showing that Reed had been awake and active on his own device during those same 38 minutes. She presented a statement from the urgent care physician explaining the sedative's pharmacological profile and its typical routes of administration. She presented the cocktail glass, which, despite having been rinsed, still carried trace amounts of the same compound on the interior rim. She also presented something I hadn't known about until 2 days before the hearing. One of my cousins, a quiet man in his 40s named Greg, who I had always liked but never been especially close to, had been awake that night. Insomnia. He had been sitting on the porch of his cabin with a book, and he had seen Reed cross the property toward my cabin at approximately 1:08 inches the morning. He had thought nothing of it at the time. When he heard what had happened, he came forward. Reed's lawyer asked Greg a series of questions designed to undermine his credibility. Greg answered each one calmly, without elaboration, without flinching. He had simply seen what he had seen. He was not angry about it. He was just there, telling the truth. The judge ruled in my favor. The frozen funds were ordered returned. Reed was additionally ordered to repay the $12,000 in cash he had withdrawn, in structured payments. The criminal case, Patricia told me afterward, would move forward separately and on its own timeline. I walked out of that courthouse into bright autumn sunlight. Patricia shook my hand on the steps and said that she would be in touch about next steps on the criminal side. I thanked her. I meant it fully. I called my grandfather that afternoon. His voice was thinner than it used to be, but clear. "Did it go all right?" he asked. "It went all right," I said. "Good boy," he said, in exactly the same tone he had used when I was 8 years old and had done something I was scared to do. I have thought a lot since then about the question my father asked without quite asking it. Is this worth it? Is pursuing this, through courts and lawyers and depositions and all the machinery of consequence, worth what it costs the family? Here's what I've come to. My father's question assumed that if I had stayed quiet, the family would have been preserved. But a family where one person can sedate another and drain their life savings, and everyone is asked to absorb that quietly for the sake of peace, that is not a family that was preserved. That is a family that was already gone, replaced by something that wore its shape. The choice wasn't between family and justice. The choice was between pretending and being honest about what was already true. I closed on my house 11 months after the reunion. It's a 2-bedroom Craftsman in a neighborhood I've loved for years, with a porch that faces west and gets good light in the evenings. I stood in the empty living room the afternoon I got the keys and just stood there for a while, listening to the quiet, my own quiet, inside my own walls. I still see Piper. Carla and I worked that out carefully and deliberately, and it matters to me more than I know how to say. Piper is 8 now. She's still the kid who comes back from wherever she's been with grass stains and that enormous grin. She doesn't know the details of what happened. She will, someday, when she's old enough for it to make sense. I'll tell her the truth, all of it, when she's ready. My relationship with my parents is different now. Careful. We talk, but there is something between us that is clear now that used to be murky, and clarity is not always the same thing as comfort. I think they understand, in a way they didn't before, that love without honesty isn't actually love. It's just proximity. If you are listening to this and you have a Reed in your family, someone who has decided that your boundaries are suggestions and your savings are a resource they can access, I want to say something directly to you. Not from a place of anger, but from a place of having sat exactly where you're sitting. Document everything. Report it. Do not let anyone, including people who love you imperfectly, convince you that staying quiet is the same thing as keeping the peace. It isn't. Silence doesn't preserve families. It just delays the reckoning while handing the cost entirely to you. You are allowed to protect what you built. You are allowed to require consequences. You are allowed to love someone and still hold them accountable for what they did. And you are not alone. If this story stayed with you, if any part of it felt familiar or true, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you've been here from the beginning, thank you for listening. It means everything.